We are back, and we are joined now by Blair LM Kelley, historian, and Joel R. Williamson, Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, author of Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Blair, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, when politicians say working class, I don't need to tell you this, but there is this implicit understanding of who we're really talking about here, and it's white people. And that doesn't really make any sense when you start to unpack it. I guess to start here, putting the question simply, how did that mythology come to be?
I think that's a great question. Oftentimes, we've really separated the idea of the work from Black people for some strange reason. I think in part because it makes us think back to slavery. It makes us think back to times that are uncomfortable. And oftentimes when people are invoking the working class, they're doing so for political purposes, right? It's election time. They want to appear to be representative of the people themselves. They're going to some Midwest diner and talking to the folks who are getting their eggs over easy and, checking in at that time. They're not really creating a conversation about the real working class in this country, which is diverse, in which Black people are heavily represented, people of color are heavily represented. And for Black people, there's an interesting and rich and unique history there.
Yeah, I mean, and you write about that, obviously, in your book, and open up the book with a story about your own family and your origins, if you don't mind telling our audience a bit about that.
Yeah, I start the whole book with the story of my great-grandfather, Solicitor Duncan. He was a sharecropper in a place called Comar, Georgia, and he had to flee after being told, harvesting a whole year's worth of cotton, that he owed money at the end of the year. He was being cheated out of the value of his labor, and his family was, really had no choice but to leave. And oftentimes when we think about the working class, we're not thinking about agricultural work. We're thinking about factories and, folks who build things and put things together. But for Black people, the beginnings of their understanding of who they are as workers starts in oftentimes in those fields. And what they suffered and also what they had, the talent, the skill, the foresight that they had, is also there in those spaces.
Yeah, and it's I mean, also something you write about that I think is so key to understanding here is that the work in and of itself, the actions of work, the active nature of it gets erased seemingly when talking about Black people. It's more just when when white people are poor, they're working class. When Black people are poor, they're just poor. And it's like erasing the notion that they are also still working while in poverty. I mean, that it's, you can see how many tropes kind of branch off of that and still exist to this day.
Absolutely. I think it strangely ties back to this notion of the lazy enslaved person. The most bizarre trope, I think, in our culture, because imagine being able to be lazy when you are forced to labor for other people. And so, the idea of the welfare queen and this disassociation that we have for Black people and hard work. And, we say, hardworking taxpayers, we're just evoking a picture that isn't a person of color, isn't a Black person. And I just wanted to, pick at the history of that.
Yes, and you do it over basically 200 years tracking this. But I actually wanted to ask you to flesh out that taxpayer notion too, because that plays very much into what you're talking about, which is just that if you're a worker, you're also contributing to society, and the white working class contributes to society. But Black people, they're not participating in our tax. They don't in the mythology of it, or the racist tropes, that they don't earn the benefits that they have because they're not contributing, I guess, to taxes in the same way. Where does that go back to?
I mean, I don't know, because what's really powerful is, I'm a person who began my career in studying segregation, and when we study the history of segregation, we see a whole generations of people who worked and got less back from the state. They got less schools, they got less public services, they got less roads, they got less everything possible, but they weren't taxed at some, colored Negro rate. They were
Right.
taxed at the same rate that every other worker was, and they literally did not get their fair share back. So the trope should really be the opposite, that for generations, Black people did not have access to the portion of the taxes that they paid.
Maybe it's just a way to work backwards to justify that kind of austerity towards certain communities.
It's something else. I mean, God bless austerity.
Yeah, well, I mean, or not, or
When I
not.
say God bless, I really always mean the opposite. Always the
Yeah,
opposite.
look, yeah, I'm
The
from the
family
north,
show.
so I'm just not from him. But I appreciate
I'm
your.
from Jersey, but I've taken on all the, let me
Oh,
pray for you.
I'm from Jersey too. I'm from
Me
Jersey
too.
too. I didn't realize that. Look at that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a big coincidence. It's the most densely populated state in the country,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yes. And
there
we're
you
the
go.
biggest diaspora all over the South.
Totally, totally. Your first chapter centers around a blacksmith who was born into slavery, and then after the Civil War, moves around and tries different jobs. Why did you choose to start at that point?
He was the farthest back ancestor I could find on my mother's side of the family. And I think, it was a powerful example of the ways in which, the enslaved had skills that they were used for the benefit of others while they were held in bondage. But when they were free, they weren't allowed to work those same jobs. Those were now considered, more privileged to be a blacksmith, to, own a small business, to have those kinds of things. And so he never was able to work in those fields as a free man, but was that as an enslaved man. And so it was just powerful for me to discover that about him, to find him in the historical record, and then to flesh out that story. One that I heard in the abstract so many times when I was studying history, but then powerful to see it in my own family.
Right. And I mean, what did that say about the way that work began to be structured and segmented and segregated too in the wake of slavery, and as Reconstruction failed and was put on hold?
I think it's really powerful. We just recently had this example of Florida schools wanting to say that, slavery was this training program for Black people, and, provided them with, great access to skills, and, shouldn't they be thankful? We now know, from actual history that the enslaved oftentimes came with skills, so that they were iron workers or stone masons or brick makers in Africa. So they were often sought out because of their skills, and the skills that they could work for the benefit of others as enslaved people. They were stripped of the right to do that work, oftentimes by law, in some of these southern states, and certainly by practice.
Right.
And so it's really powerful to see the deskilling of Black people that happens pretty systematically.
Yeah, that was the DeSantis controversy
Yeah.
down in Florida, and it's just it's
God bless him
completely
too.
right. Gosh, you're so much nicer than I am. Like it is clearly ahistorical given the context that you say, because there were different prices put on human beings based on the skills that they brought over when they were taken against their will from the continent of Africa. I mean, and in your research on this, did you see how some of those skills were passed down and were a part of like the understanding for many of the Black working class?
Absolutely. I think, we can see in slavery that people are, as you said, being purchased because of their skills. They're highlighted because of their skills. And then they don't have the right to it over time. But when we look back, I also really wanted to complicate the notion of skill when it comes to labor. Most of us, think of skilled trades. We've been taught in history classes like a carpenter or a brick maker or something like that. Those people are skilled and other workers are unskilled. But I write about laundresses, for example. They made soap, they boiled water, they could wring the water out of things and press things with just actual pieces of iron. And not burn up all the clothes and have them looking horrible. They were clean, they were folded, they were ready for the week under their skill, and they're considered unskilled labor. But I mean, I dare most of us to try and go do those things right now successfully
Right.
without taking a better part of a month to figure all those things out.
It's also dangerous work. I mean,
Yeah,
and
extremely dangerous work, and they knew what they were doing, and they
right.
passed those skills down over time. And so I love to complicate this notion of skilled work. During the pandemic, I was watching the farm workers reels about them harvesting vegetables, and you could see them grabbing a bunch of vegetables and packaging them up the way we get them in the supermarket before you could even really see what they were doing. And it was just a reminder, that's unskilled work, and
Right.
yet it's not. And we have to change the way that we look at workers in history and in our present, and value the skills and the wisdom that they bring to their jobs.
I mean, there's no way for work or labor to be unskilled, basically, essentially by definition, unless what's unskilled is earning a bunch of passive income off of investments. That doesn't require much skill to sit on
Those
your
accountants
ass.
are in there, honey. Those accountants are working.
No, totally. But like the people that outsource it to the accountants, I don't know if you can count that like the money that comes from that as
You have to
skill.
work really hard to pick the best accountant.
I guess you're right. I
You're
guess you're right.
underestimating it.
Once again, more charitable than I am. Uh, you mentioned the pandemic. I know I'm skipping way, way, way into the future, but people can read your wonderful book to get the kind of the timeline and the history that you trace this through. But just to bring it to kind of our current context, these fault lines were really evident, I think, in the
Yeah.
pandemic, and who was deemed essentially as sacrificial to continue their labor to keep our capitalist structure afloat in the midst of this major shock. And I'll never forget hearing, what was it, Ken Paxton, the attorney general in Texas. Was he the attorney general? I forget. Essentially saying that grandmas should be sacrificing themselves to for
Yeah.
the good of their children and keeping work going, even when we had only been shut down for a few weeks at that point. But the people that it was Dan Patrick. Sorry, Lieutenant Governor, not the Attorney General. My apologies. But from Texas at that point, like
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
that was really a real drive, and the people that were on the front lines of that were often the black working class. How central was that period to your the impulse for you to write this book?
Yeah, I was writing during the pandemic, and so many uh, essential workers were Black workers. Black workers are overrepresented in the ranks of essential workers by about double the population. They were not able to figure out what was going on. They couldn't shelter in place. They just kept working. So many of the women that I am at church with are CNAs. They work in hospitals. They were, food prep. They were postal workers. They didn't have any time away. They just kept working. There was no break for them, even as we didn't even understand exactly what we were facing. And so that profound sacrifice that working people had to make in that time period, went unrecognized. There was no big recognition of what they had done, and it's a continuation of this longer history. The unequal burden borne by working people in this country just continues to be unrecognized, and so for me, writing this book at that time was just such a reminder that it's past time for us to recognize what working people do.
Yeah, and what does the recognition look like in terms of moving beyond recognition and into
Oh
you could
yeah.
say reparations, but also wage increases and like a collective understanding of what we're putting a working class through to work 3 minimum wage jobs to survive, for example, in
Yeah,
many
I mean,
states.
I'm
Yes.
so excited to see so many folks going on strike, so many folks thinking about labor differently. My generation basically was told over and over again that labor unions were bad for people. When I studied these labor unions, these Black labor unions in my book, I discovered that labor unions were concerned about the country as a whole. They're not just concerned about an hourly wage or better benefits for the folks that they are representing, but they're really calling the question of what workers deserve. They deserve health care. They deserve pay time off. They deserve living wages. They deserve to be able to live in homes near the places where they work. Our country can do much better when it comes to workers of all backgrounds. And Black workers and the history of Black workers is a reminder that workers have the wisdom to know what they need and to demand it. And we should start listening as a country.
What was your reaction to some of the coverage of these strikes too, and when we're getting the tropes of the working class, I guess coming back to the fore and who is working class and who is not, the portrayed image of the auto worker, for example, versus the reality and the diversity of the auto worker. And the solidarity shown, honestly, cross-racially in these massive strikes, which is inspiring and bridging many of the divides, I would say, that you talk about.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Even the actors unions have done a fine job of really, unearthing the exploitation that's at the center of their work. The auto workers, the UPS strike. People tried to come back like, well, UPS workers shouldn't be making $70,000 a year. But when we think about $70,000 a year in many places in the country, that's just breaking through where you might be able to afford to live there and afford to raise a family. And so why do we continue to push this idea that working people shouldn't be able to live in the places where they do their labor? We owe everyone so much more. And so I'm glad to see that all these union conversations have really been forcing us to think again about what workers are doing, and they're breaking the silence and I think the stereotypes about organized labor that have been pushed by folks who don't want to see it.
Can you talk more about the domestic labor too, and how that plays into some of the preconceived notions about who is working class and who is not?
What was powerful to me it was to see that the domestic workers, folks who clean people's houses, watch their kids, cook in their homes, it was a burst of those women, Black women who were doing that labor in the mid 20th century. I like to say Rosie the Riveter had a maid. So often we were thinking about the white women who were able to get federal jobs in the Second World War. Black women were, for the most part, and there were exceptions, but for the most part, not able to get access to those jobs without protest and without years of rallying to get access. And so the jobs that they got were in white households in that time period that were unprotected by the same
Yes.
federal jobs recognitions that everyone else had. And they continue to be unprotected by federal legislation. And we're still fighting to make sure that domestic workers have these right to organize, can be covered by the same basic things like an 8-hour workday and breaks and time off that everyone else can benefit from. This cutout that was, created by segregationists more than 100 years ago can't still stand. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really profound to think about it. But we have to do better. We have to continue to call the question of what does this labor look like, and how essential is it? And it's not something we can outsource. It's not something robots can do. The care of our elders, the care of our homes, the care of our children is valuable work. And why aren't we paying a living wage?
It is incredibly important to point that out. I mean, given the fact that Gavin Newsom a few weeks ago, 2 months ago or so, vetoed expanded workplace protections for domestic workers in California. Like, this is a problem that crosses party lines.
It
And
does.
some of the things that you talk about, what domestic workers have had to go through with that little, the threadbare or non-existent protection from the government, is like wage theft is a guarantee, but there's
Yes,
also the opportunity, and there were instances of sexual assault that just
absolutely.
recreate the conditions of slavery or continue them.
Absolutely. The profound ways in which it was an understood danger that Black women faced of sexual assault, particularly in times of economic crisis. There was something called the Bronx slave market that my favorite civil rights activist Ella Baker wrote about in the 1930s during the midst of the Depression, where Black women workers would line up on streets and get picked up for day labor. And then taken and then oftentimes not paid, or given some old clothes or old shoes or food as pay instead of money that they had negotiated for, or were simply assaulted by the people who picked them up. And again, what's profound is that we can still see open markets. If you go to a Home Depot in many states in the morning, you'll see people who are waiting for work, who are unprotected, who are vulnerable to attack, to wage theft, to any number of things. And those conditions that Black women faced then are still being faced by workers today.
We've spoken about that on this program, how really the the Republicans don't actually want to stop illegal immigration, as they say, right? Because they do want a permanent underclass of workers that they can exploit. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you see parallels to the modern day a little bit with many undocumented people, based
Yes.
on your research and your scholarship.
Yes. The vulnerability that Black workers have faced and continue to face are amplified for people who don't have documentation to work in this country. They are suffering from all those vulnerabilities that you could imagine because of their status. And it's really profound that we don't have a means by which to protect workers, and it suppresses everybody's wages. It makes those workers vulnerable. We need all the people who are laboring in this country to labor. Our country doesn't function without it, and so we need to find a way to make a gateway for workers to have documentation and status in this country in a way that's fair and open and available to the folks who we really still depend on.
Lastly, before I let you go, Blair, you also touch on the myth of the Trump working class voter, and there were working class people that voted for Trump, for sure.
Sure, absolutely.
But we saw this on January 6th, where like some of the most frustrating dialogue afterwards was these are, people with lots of class resentment and working class people storming the Capitol, and you look up who they were, and they own
They got hotel rooms in DC.
Yeah, they own a pool business in Missouri. Yeah,
how expensive it is to get like a hotel room near the Capitol.
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
They paid for flights to come to DC to do an insurrection, and like you look up and they own a restaurant in.
Yeah. Bosses love to let employees do that.
Right. We need vacation. You need vacation time, right?
I mean, my gosh. The middle class that's full of resentment, is really the bigger part of that phenomenon. And so it was, it tickles me that most working people couldn't afford to really take on all those challenges of the logistics of the Capitol on that day.
The logistics of a coup. Yeah, it's just that's what you get. Right, working class people can't really work through that, I guess. But I guess even more than January 6th, just if you could expand on the mythology around the Trump voter and the white working class.
Yeah, I think that as we said, the average Trump voter is a non-college educated middle class person, and the mythology that this is really about. The pain of the working class. The majority of the working class in this country is diverse, and could be benefited by the things that we're all workers of all backgrounds need. Everybody needs a higher living wage. Everybody needs protections. Everyone needs decent health care that they can access. Everyone needs assistance with housing. This is not a racialized problem. I'm writing about Black Black people and the ways in which they have navigated this world. But the things that those workers need benefit every worker in this country. And so, if we can get past the danger of the mythology around race and the notion of this zero-sum game that we keep staying stuck in, the country as a whole could do so much better.
Well, Blair LM Kelley, historian, Joel R. Williamson, Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, author of Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing this with us. We will put a link to your book in the description wherever you're watching or listening to this and at majority.fm. Thank you, Blair, for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was great.